Hi, this is Gertie Remy, and I've gotten a few requests to state what I felt about the our country and our state opening up. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that. Forgive me a little bit because I came from work, and before settling in, I wanted to do the video because this is not just about my opinion. It's basically about facts. I didn't want to put too much of what I think about it. So I wanted to just reach out to people as far as like the concept of what's going on based on our past history, our past illnesses and diseases and viruses, and bring that forward into the present so we can see how we level up to it. So I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible, and we'll start. So I wrote some notes down, and basically it's like, okay, a virus, right? We know that viruses affects large different cell types. A virus is what we call like a pathogen or an illness. There's different form of viruses. A bacteria and a virus are two different things. But for the sake of what's going on because of the coronavirus, I will be speaking about viruses. A virus also can carry a foreign DNA into a cell, right? It's a foreign substance. It goes into your cell, into your DNA. A virus also cannot reproduce by itself, right? It needs a host. It doesn't replicate on its own. What it does is that it infects a cell, and it produces more virus once it affects the cell. But what it does is it directly overtakes the cell. It kind of tricks the cell into saying, hey, we're friends, welcome me into your home, your cell type, and then it locks in. And then once it does that, it pretty much takes over by pretending to be one of the cells. So that's basically how it replicates. And the way it does that, because it's all about the proteins. I'm not going to get complicated into like proteins and enzymes, but the viruses on the surface, they're proteins, and proteins are also binders. So it binds onto like what's called a receptor cell. And then when it gets into that receptor cell, it infects the receptor cell because it locks into it, takes over it, and then it passes through like I'm going to go through our basic like biology class here. It crosses over to the plasma membrane of that cell, and once it's in there, the whole protective envelope is like gone, and then it goes into the cytoplasm, and from there the nucleus, and then into the DNA. Once it gets into the DNA, it does the whole mRNA issue, like it gets into there, and it becomes one of the cell, so that the body doesn't see it as a foreign substance because it's within the DNA and the mRNA of the cell. Okay, and then once it get into that, it infects the whole cell, and it takes over. It causes that cell to die, and that's how it lives, right? It's like a parasite. So basically a virus is a parasite, a real biological form of a parasite. So the name of viruses are made from the disease that it's caused, right? For example, we have the HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus, right? We also have like the polio virus. We have the adenovirus. We have the herpes virus. The adenovirus is what caused like the common cold, or like basic not flu-like, but your basic colds. And the things that the lifespan of that is 2 to 3 weeks, which is why the cold just keeps coming on and on again. It's too short for researchers to kind of hone down on what causes it, and then to find a way to get rid of it, because it's just 2 to 3 weeks, the whole process. The herpes virus that we know causes different things such as chickenpox. It causes shingles. It also causes like, sores, blister sores, in very basic parts of the body. The rabies virus, which we know causes for animals and people to develop what's called, I'm going to quote, MAD, because that's actually not a good word for me anymore, but it causes like outrageous mental behaviors. And I'll get more into that. And of course, we have the flu virus. I'm going to add on a bacteria because I know this is about viruses, but I want to add on to a bacteria, and that bacteria is going to be TB. What all of these have in common is that they are communicable diseases. They're diseases that can spread onto your body and become deadly. So let's talk about HIV first. It's a passion of mine because of the way it all played out. It played out while I was still alive, so it's something that I could remember hearing in the news when I was young, and I felt personally impacted by it based on my own nationality as being a Haitian. But with the HIV virus, it was clearly seen as an illness that was labeled for certain people. And because of that, I can basically say nothing was done until the right group of people started dying, until the right, there's no right to death, but it took until those deaths occurred for it to be founded. And by the way, I am going to let you know that every information that I got to pass on to everyone came from the National Academy of Sciences, the World Health Organization, the National Institute of Health, the CDC, and definitely, and of course the HIV website itself, the rabies virus website, and the flu. So they're direct.orgs. Okay. So the HIV virus, we know that it, as per the World Health Organization, we know that it has claimed more than 32 million lives worldwide. It wasn't until prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, and that to have for it to be a care that was managed. HIV is considered a manageable chronic health care condition because there is no cure for it as of yet. Hopefully, with research, we can find a cure. There's treatment, but not a cure. And the treatment, just keeps the virus from attacking the body. With that also, we know that it is transmitted through blood, semen, vaginal fluids, through breast milk. At one time, they did say like the spinal fluids, like the spinal cavity. It is not transmitted through saliva and tears. And that's very important because that's what was thought of before. With the HIV virus, it was first noted, the first document case, it's way back in history, but the first document case it was reported on June 5th, 1981. By the end of the year, 337 reported cases had happened in America, and 321 of those were adults, and 16 were children under 13. It's very important to see that for what I'm saying. In 1981, we had 337 reported cases. In September the 28th, 1982, there was a legislation that was introduced to allocate funding to AIDS research and treatment, right? Had it been developed in September 28, 1982, whereas it was first reported in June 1981, so a little bit over a year. At that time, a lot of death would not have occurred. However, 15 months, it didn't pass. The legislation didn't pass. And until 15 months later, so it did finally pass in July 1983 to allocate funding, although that funding was like very little funding. The timeline is April 23rd, 1984. The retrovirus was discovered with diagnostic testing. Now there's this whole thing about France and America, who developed it first, who discovered it first. There was a big lawsuit that ensued. That's not where I'm at right now. July the 25th, 1985, and August the 27th, 1985. Remember, 81, only a little bit over 300 people affected by it. And by the way, 130 people had died of the 337 people. So July 25th and August 27th, Rock Hudson announced that he had contracted the HIV virus, and actually I think he said he had AIDS. And then Ryan White, through blood transfusion for Ryan White, and with Rock Hudson through lifestyle, right? But he was like American Sweetheart as an actor. They changed the way that people viewed HIV and AIDS, right? Because at first it was, they were blaming gays, Haitians. Remember the 4 H's I talk about: the hemophiliacs, the homosexual, the Haitians, and the IV drug users, right? Heroin and drug users. So Rock Hudson and Ryan White changed the way that people viewed that. With that, in September the 17th, 1985, 4 years after being told about HIV, and in his second term, President Reagan, for the first time, publicly mentioned AIDS. For the first time, 4 years after, he said that he was going to make it a top priority. And now, he was already by 85 in his second term. October the 2nd, 1985. Now, mind you, that would happen to be like a month or 2 months right after Rock Hudson and Ryan White. It's unfortunate they passed, but it took them dying to get his attention. So October the 2nd, 1985, the U.S. allocates $190 million for AIDS research. Now, I think the first one was like 12 million, and then it was like 70 million. It wasn't even going to touch research. So this went to 190 million in 1985. And then in March the 19th, 1987, FDA approves the first medication for AIDS. And I know you all know what that is. That is the AZT, of course, later on to be a really bad drug, but initially it helped a lot of people. That was 6 years later, 6 years after the first reported case, where there were only 337 cases reported for that year. 6 years later is when we first had our first medication, but by then we have already lost over 100,000 people. This was in America. So June the 24th, 1987, President Reagan had his first public speech on AIDS. And that was exactly almost 6 years later, because it was June 5th when it was first noted, and this is June 24th, 1987. By then, the reported cases towards the end of 1988 was in the U.S. had reached about 100,000 people. So what I got with that is that it wasn't until it infected and affected people that, what did not look like an AIDS crisis or AIDS person, because of racism, right? That's all it is. And I'm going to tie this all up because we saw the process, right? Once they found out that it was the retrovirus, and then we had proper testing, and with proper testing, we had proper treatment. Going back to now rabies. So rabies, we know, is initially called, it makes a person mad, and people would definitely die if there were no vaccines, if bitten by an infected animal. It's a virus, and it's called a raging violent behavior because that's what it does. It causes the person to hallucinate. It affects your CNS, your central nervous system. And once it goes in there, pretty much after it reaches the exposure, it's 2 to 10 days the person dies. You're about 1 to 3 months before you first see symptoms from exposure. But once a person gets the symptoms, they pretty much die within the first 2 to 10 days. Right? So rabies is also considered a zoonotic disease. And what that means is from animals to human. Right now, presently, we have over 26,000 cases of people who die each year from rabies, and that's worldwide. And that's really important to know because the numbers are so much greater. But however, each year, about 15 million people receive a post-bite vaccination against rabies. Like they were bitten or they thought they were bitten. Like they were saying, like bats, if you find a bat that's sleeping in your area, definitely go and get a rabies vaccination. So that's what's called a post-bite. With that, it prevented hundreds of thousands of deaths per year. So there's a thing that wants to be achieved, and it's called a zero human rabies death by 2030, and it's different countries with the World Health Organization also, and that's because rabies comes in type 1, type 2, and type 3. So different types. So they want to eradicate rabies. But almost all human cases of rabies are fatal. They were fatal, so basically somebody got rabies virus, they died, right? The best thing is they isolate the person, quarantine them, and they would die. So almost all were through death, except until in 1885 by Pasteur and Roux, right? So they developed the process of getting a rabies vaccination. And then from that, so remember, it's isolation, quarantine, they find a vaccination with treatment, and then with the vaccination, all of our pets, I have a dog, all of our pets get their annual rabies vaccination. And what we do is make sure our pets are like supervised to not be around other pets that are possibly sick, and we don't handle wild animals. And so with the vaccine, it's 100% effective. Definitely. The next one I wanted to talk about was polio. Now, I had said that, so polio is with the polio virus, right? So polio, was like in the 1940s and 50s. In fact, we had one of our presidents that was infected with polio. It was once considered the most feared disease in the 1940s and 50s. Just ask Roosevelt. It caused more than 15,000 paralytic cases annually, and this is like present day, but before it used to cause a lot more. It was spread by fecal oral route. It enters the mouth, it goes into the intestine, it multiplies in the intestine, and then the infected person, they said, sheds it. So basically, I guess through passing gas or having a stool, bowel movement. And then with that, the virus lives in the environment for several weeks. I mean, we think the coronavirus with 3 days, it lives several weeks. And that's just because of the way it's encapsulated, the way it spreads. There's type 1, type 2, type 3. So it's a good thing because of research and our good quarantine technique and medication through the vaccination. We have eradicated, type 2 was eradicated in 2015 in America. Type 3 was eradicated in 2019. Type 1 still exists, but with vaccination, people don't get the polio virus anymore. It still remains. So basically, people were quarantined by the public health officials, and then they were vaccinated. And so the U.S. has been free of polio since 1979. Now, what that means, like people who were born in the U.S. Now, for those who are born in other countries, if vaccination is not like required when they are born or when they're a child, then coming into another country like the U.S., they can come in with the virus. I want to talk about the the influenza, not the coronavirus, just the basic flu, influenza, with preface to the 1918 H1N1. Yes, that's what it was called. It was the original H1N1, and it went into different waves. It had wave 1, wave 2, and wave 3. Now, I should have probably talked about this first, but I wanted to speak on those first. Now, the flu, the H1N1, we know came around again several times, and just like SARS. So the flu, the way it works is that it's like a family, right? And there's familiarity with that, right? So you can have one set, and then another, it mutates into something else with still the same family, right? It's an extended family. You have brothers and sisters, basically the same thing. So it comes like the background, the DNA, the way it replicates, pretty much the same, except yearly it mutates. So the actual flu vaccinations that we're getting, people get it based on previous flus, would hope that the body would recognize it and then not get it again. But if that same flu doesn't come around again the following year, it will, I don't want to say I'll render it ineffective, because I'm not saying don't take the flu vax. It's just that you may get a mild symptom instead of a major one if it's not the same one. So the flu vaccination, just know that because the flu comes in seasons, and it's when, as it's going, then they can test and develop a vaccination for it. But the one that occurred in 1918, the H1N1, had a death toll, they said 21 million, but later it was revised by scientists and microbiologists and epidemiologists and statisticians. It was said that it was 50 to 100 million. So the first wave, they say, was mild, right? What would be considered mild compared to the second wave? It was dismissed as something else, cholera, diarrhea, something else. It was dismissed even by doctors. The second wave came weeks later, and then the third wave came in 1919, and it lasted till 1920. If we know history, we know at the same time we were going through World War I, towards the tail end of World War I. So, of course, unfortunately, the flu was not something that they wanted to spread, although captains and sergeants in the military were writing to the military, they're writing to their generals and stuff saying, hey, we're losing 100 men per day. People are just dropping, they're just dying, and they just like propagandized it and didn't say what it was. When the first wave hit, they said that ironically, people who got sick with the milder form, they were actually resistant to the second and third wave. But then when the second and third wave came, it was the harshest one. It was very violent. They said the lungs of the people basically looked like they had poison gas. So they went into acute respiratory distress, syndrome. So basically they had RS. And that was in the younger population, 20 to 40 years old. The treatment at the time was definitely, they said, total isolation. Not, hey, if you want to quarantine, not, we're going to take a pause. Totally quarantine. They totally isolated everyone because they wanted to slow the virus. The finding was that in the second wave, where it had hit previously, it just slowed down as far as the people that it was that was getting hit. But so as it started, it was the initial site that hit that got the brunt of it, and as it kept going, it got weaker. So what they were saying is that most likely if you had the mild symptoms with the first one and went into isolation when the second wave came, like I said before, the people did not get hit. But the cities that got struck the most were like New York, right? It is 1918 and 1919. New York, New Orleans, which also got struck the most right now, Boston, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Philly, Louisville. All those were cities with metropolitan areas. The proximity of the initial outbreak was greater than the latter, and of course, and that was based on illness and in death. What also happened is that the first wave hit in mid-spring, like us right now, and that was the first wave. When the first wave hit, it was right, like I said, we were going through World War I, so the news media did not want to focus on that. There was government propaganda going on, and there was actually a law that was passed around the same time that says you cannot talk bad about the government. It was a legislation, yes, a real legislation, that you couldn't speak bad about the government or else you would get 20 years in jail time. So because of that, there was no negative articles that people wrote about it, and the few people that did speak about it did get imprisoned. So the only person that did, or the country that did speak about it, was Spain, because Spain did not participate in the war. And so that is why it is racistly called the Spanish flu. Isn't that something? The one country that wanted to enlighten the world about something that was killing people, that eventually killed 50 to 100 million people, got labeled as to that's where it came from. And basically, that's not where they think it came from, which is not where it came from. They were just the ones that were not in war, so they didn't have a vested interest to propagandize it. They were like, hey, this is killing people. Also noted that because of the legislation they passed about not speaking bad about our country, a lot of half-truths were talked about, a lot of outright lies, right? Like basically what's going on right now. We have people who are saying that, oh, this is going to go. They were telling the public that rest assured the worst is over. And they were like, fear kills more than the disease. Just like, 45 said, the cure should not cost more than the illness or be more devastating than the illness. Some weird thing that he said, which made no sense. So, so a lot of half-truths and things were going on. And schools were closed, just like they are now. There were isolation. People were, they didn't want people to congregate with each other because they figured until they figure out what it was, let's just isolate people. But then, of course, you had those that were saying this is not a public health measure. There's no cause to panic or alarm. But people could see that their friends, their neighbors, their family members were dying like they're seeing now. And it's like, but you're telling us like not to worry about it. Okay, so because of that, they had no one to turn to. They had no one to rely on. And they couldn't trust anyone, right? Because it's like you're afraid, but like the legislators are saying one thing and then you see people who are dying at the same time. I mean, you can't hide 50 to 100 million deaths. So what I've learned in that is that, basically the same thing is going on right now. The last thing I want to talk about, which is a bacteria, but just another very communicable disease that is very deadly, is tuberculosis. So tuberculosis, we know it's the Mycobacterium bacilli, right? It's the TB. And it's it hit really hard in the 16 to 1800s in Europe. It caused 25% of all deaths in Europe. That's it. That's not 3%. That's 25%. And at the time in the U.S., like towards the the 1700s to 1800s, it killed 1 out of every 7 people in America. So TB, airborne, very dangerous. Immediately, with them not knowing where it came from, although it was there from centuries, but it looked like it came out of nowhere. The first thing, unfortunately, that they did, one of our dark pasts, is that they built sanatoriums. Originally, it was meant to be something where you can just like lay in the sun and eat healthy food, but we all seen the pictures so that it became like a prison. It was a very nasty prison for people who were poor and where their families, they were taken away from their families and they were dying in like metal cots and a lot of stuff going on. So those sanatoriums were a really bad thing, but they were actually a lot of them, because I think, they said 839 sanatoriums were developed